She rolled her eyes. A slow, deliberate gesture that said everything without words. The old man's trembling hand held the menu like it was made of lead, his weathered fingers struggling to turn pages that seemed to mock his failing grip. Around him, the Saturday morning rush at Murphy's Diner buzzed with the comfortable chaos of weekend breakfast crowds. Families laughed over pancakes. College students nursed hangovers with coffee and bacon. But at table 7, an 83-year-old veteran sat alone, invisible to everyone except the waitress, who clearly wished he would disappear. "Sir, I've been standing here for 5 minutes," Jessica snapped, her voice cutting through his concentration like a blade. She was 22, blonde, pretty in that effortless way that made tips flow like water. Her name tag caught the morning. Light streaming through the diner's windows, and beneath it, her patience had worn thinner than the bacon she served. "Other customers are waiting." The old man looked up, his blue eyes still sharp despite the deep lines that mapped 8 decades of life across his face. "I'm sorry, miss. These letters are smaller than they used to be." His voice carried the soft rasp of age, but underneath it lay something else. Something that spoke of commands given in foxholes and decisions made when death breathed down young necks. "Could you perhaps recommend something? I'm not particular about—" "The number 7 combo," Jessica interrupted, snatching the menu from his hands with unnecessary force. "Eggs over easy, wheat toast, coffee, $12.95. That work for you?" She didn't wait for an answer. Her pen was already moving across the order pad, each stroke a small act of violence against courtesy. Around them, the diner continued its morning symphony. Spatulas scraped against the grill. Coffee percolated in endless cycles. Conversations flowed and ebbed like tides. But something had shifted at table 7, something that made the nearby customers glance over with discomfort, then quickly look away. The old man's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, a movement so small it might have been mistaken for settling into his chair. But those who had lived long enough to recognize defeat when it whispered would have seen it for what it was. The collapse of dignity. "That's fine. Thank you," he said quietly. His hands, which had once steadied rifles and carried wounded comrades, now folded carefully on the Formica tabletop. There was a tremor there, slight but persistent. The kind that comes not from fear but from years and medication and the simple truth that bodies, no matter how strong they once were, eventually surrender to time. Jessica turned away without acknowledgement, her sneakers squeaking against the checkered linoleum as she headed toward the kitchen. Behind her, the old man sat straighter, a reflex ingrained by decades of military bearing. His back never touched the chair. Old habits, forged in boot camps and battlefields, died harder than the men who carried them. At the counter, 2 construction workers noticed the exchange. One nudged the other and whispered something that made them both glance back at table 7. Their expression said everything: discomfort, embarrassment, the particular shame that comes from witnessing cruelty and doing nothing to stop it. They looked at their plates, suddenly very interested in their hash browns. In booth 4, a mother with 3 young children had seen it too. She whispered something to her husband, who shook his head and returned to cutting his daughter's pancakes. "Not our business," the gesture said. "Stay out of it. Mind your own affairs." The universal language of social cowardice. The old man seemed to understand. He had seen this before, this collective turning away. It happened in grocery stores when he fumbled for change, in parking lots when his walker moved too slowly for impatient drivers, in a dozen small interactions each day where the world made clear that his time had passed, his usefulness expired, his very presence an inconvenience to be endured rather than honored. But what none of them knew, what Jessica herself would soon discover, was that dignity doesn't retire with age, honor doesn't fade with trembling hands, and sometimes, just sometimes, the universe has a way of reminding us that respect is not a gift we give to the worthy, but a debt we owe to those who earned it when we were still learning to tie our shoes. The bell above Murphy's front door chimed. Not the gentle tinkle of a casual entrance, but the firm, decisive sound of someone who had arrived with purpose. Jessica, returning from the kitchen with a coffee pot and her practiced smile for paying customers, didn't look up immediately. She was busy refilling cups at table 3, where a group of real estate agents were deep in conversation about market, trends, and commission splits. But the old man at table 7 looked up. And in that moment, across 30 feet of diner floor and 30 years of time, 2 sets of eyes met in recognition that hit like lightning on a clear day. The man in the doorway was 55, maybe 60, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made rooms take notice. His hair was steel gray, cut with military precision, and when he moved, it was with the fluid economy of someone who had learned that wasted motion could cost lives. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, but he carried himself like he was still wearing dress blues. His eyes swept the diner once, professionally, cataloging exits and angles and the positions of everyone inside. It was a habit that never died, this constant assessment of tactical situations. But when his gaze found table 7, everything else ceased to matter. "Dear God," he whispered, and the words carried across the sudden quiet that had fallen over the diner. Because somehow, without anyone knowing why, every conversation had slowed, every movement had paused, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The old man's fork, halfway to his mouth with a bite of scrambled eggs, stopped midway. His hand began to shake more violently, but this time it wasn't age or medication. This was recognition hitting like a physical blow, like the concussion from an artillery shell exploding too close. Jessica, still oblivious to the drama unfolding, behind her, continued her rounds with the coffee pot. She laughed at something one of the real estate agents said, her voice bright and careless, the sound jarringly inappropriate in the sudden tension that filled the diner like smoke. The man in the doorway took 3 steps forward, then stopped. His face had gone pale, and his hands, which hung loose at his sides, slowly curled into fists, not from anger, but from the overwhelming need to maintain control when control was the only thing standing between composure and complete emotional collapse. "Frank?" he said, and the name carried across the diner like a prayer, like a question that had waited 3 decades for an answer, like the final piece of a puzzle that had been missing so long everyone had forgotten it was incomplete. The old man's fork clattered to his plate. The sound echoed in the sudden silence like a gunshot, sharp and final. His blue eyes, which had seemed faded just moments before, suddenly blazed with a light that made him look 20 years younger. "Tommy?" The name came out as barely a whisper, but in that whisper was a lifetime of brotherhood forged in mud and blood and shared terror. In that whisper was the sound of 2 young men who had promised each other they would survive, no matter what hell had in store for them. What happened next would change not just that restaurant, but everyone who witnessed it. Because sometimes the most powerful moments in life happen not in grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but in the simple recognition that some bonds are too strong for time to break, some debts too sacred for society to ignore, and some men too honorable for any waitress to diminish. Jessica was about to learn that lesson in the most public, most humiliating way possible. And everyone else in Murphy's Diner was about to witness something that would remind them why respect is not optional, honor is not outdated, and dignity is not something you lose with age. It's something you earn by surviving when survival seemed impossible. Tommy Morrison stood frozen in the doorway of Murphy's Diner, his world tilting on its axis as 30 years collapsed into a single moment of recognition. The man at table 7 wasn't just any old man. He was Staff Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, United States Army, 1st Infantry Division. The man who had saved Tommy's life in a jungle clearing outside Duke Fo when Tommy was 19 years old and bleeding out from shrapnel wounds that should have killed him. The man who had carried him through 2 miles of enemy territory while bullets whined overhead and mortars exploded close enough to shower them with debris. The man who had refused 3 direct orders to abandon the wounded and save himself. The man who had looked a commanding officer in the eye and said, "No soldier left behind, sir. Not on my watch. Not ever." Tommy's legs moved without conscious thought, carrying him across the diner floor, past tables full of customers who sensed something momentous happening but couldn't quite understand what. His boots, steel-toed work boots that had carried him, through 30 years of construction jobs seemed to echo with the rhythm of combat boots marching through Vietnamese mud. Frank Rodriguez watched him approach, and in his eyes was the same mixture of disbelief and joy that Tommy felt burning in his chest. They were different men now. Frank's dark hair had gone completely white, his face lined with age and pain and the accumulated weight of decades. Tommy's broad frame showed the soft spread of middle age, his hands marked by calluses from construction work instead of rifle maintenance. But underneath the years, underneath the changes that time had carved into their bodies and souls, they were still the same two soldiers who had shared a foxhole and a promise and a bond that went deeper than blood. "Jesus Christ, Frank," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion as he reached table 7. "I've been looking for you for 30 fucking years." The profanity hung in the air of the family restaurant, but no one complained. There was something in Tommy's voice, something raw and powerful and absolutely authentic, that made the usual social conventions seem petty and irrelevant. Frank started to stand, his movements careful and deliberate, the way of a man whose bones had been broken too many times and never quite healed right. But before he could fully rise, Tommy was there, his arms wrapping around the older man in an embrace that was 30 years in the making. They held each other like drowning men hold life preservers, like soldiers hold the hope of home, like brothers hold the promise of never letting go again. Around them, the diner had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds had stopped, as if the entire world had paused to witness this reunion. "I thought you were dead," Tommy whispered into Frank's shoulder. "After the hospital, after they shipped me back, I tried to find you. I wrote letters. I called the VA. I hired a private investigator with money I didn't have. I thought that jungle took you after all." Frank pulled back slightly, his hands gripping Tommy's shoulders with surprising strength. "I tried to find you too, mijo. Every year I tried. But Morrison is a common name, and I didn't know your middle initial, and the Army, they don't make it easy for old soldiers to find each other." Jessica, who had been moving between tables with her coffee pot, finally noticed the commotion. She approached table 7 with the irritated expression of someone whose routine had been disrupted, her professional smile already slipping into place. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the emotional reunion like a saw through silk. "Sir, you can't just come in here and disturb our customers. If you want to visit, you need to order something or—" She stopped mid-sentence as Tommy turned to look at her. His face had changed, transformed from joy to something much darker and infinitely more dangerous. In his eyes was a fury so pure and cold that it made the temperature in the diner seem to drop 10 degrees. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying the kind of authority that made career soldiers snap to attention and construction crews fall silent. Jessica, suddenly aware that she had stepped into something far beyond her understanding, took a small step backward. "I just said that if he wants to visit, he needs to order something. This is a restaurant, not a social club." Tommy's gaze shifted to Frank's table, taking in the barely touched breakfast, the cheap coffee in the stained cup, the way Frank's hands still trembled slightly as he reached for his napkin. "How long has he been waiting for his food?" "About 10 minutes, Jessica said, her voice defensive. "It takes time to—" "How long has he been waiting for his food?" Tommy repeated, and this time his voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone who was accustomed to getting straight answers to direct questions. Jessica's eyes darted around the diner, suddenly aware that every customer was watching, waiting to see how this confrontation would play out. "Maybe 20 minutes, she admitted. "And in those 20 minutes, how many other people have you served?" Tommy asked. "How many plates have come out of that kitchen for customers who came in after this man?" Jessica didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The evidence was all around them. The family in booth 4 had received their pancakes and eaten half of them. The construction workers at the counter were on their second cups of coffee. The real estate agents had been served, eaten, and were now discussing whether to order dessert. "I see," Tommy said, his voice still quiet, but somehow more threatening than if he had been shouting. "So let me understand this. This man, who is old enough to be your grandfather, who has been sitting here patiently and politely, gets to wait while you serve everyone else first. Is that your usual policy for senior customers?" "It's not like that," Jessica protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "I serve tables in order, and sometimes the kitchen gets backed up and—" "Bullshit," Tommy said flatly, and the word hit the diner like a physical blow. "I watched you for the last 10 minutes. I saw you refill coffee for everyone in this place. Except him. I saw you laugh and chat with those real estate people while he sat here with an empty cup. I saw you roll your eyes when he asked for a recommendation." Frank reached up and touched Tommy's arm gently. "Tommy, it's okay. It's not important." Tommy looked down at his old friend, and for a moment his expression softened. But when he looked back at Jessica, the fury returned, harder and colder than before. "Not important?" he said. "Frank, this man just treated you like garbage. She made you feel small and worthless and invisible. How is that not important?" The diner remained frozen, everyone watching this confrontation unfold with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident. In the kitchen, the cook had appeared in the pass-through window, his spatula forgotten in his hand as he strained to hear every word. "You want to know who you just disrespected?" Tommy continued, his voice rising slightly. "You want to know who you decided wasn't worth common human courtesy?" Jessica's face had gone pale, and she took another step backward. "Sir, I think you're overreacting." "This man," Tommy said, pointing at Frank with a gesture that somehow managed to be both protective and proud, "is a United States Army veteran who served 2 tours in Vietnam. He earned a Purple Heart, a Silver Star, and a Bronze Star with V for Valor. He saved 7 men in a single firefight, including me. He carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire when anyone with sense would have taken cover. He came home to protests and spit and people calling him a baby killer, and he never complained. Not once. Not ever." The silence in the diner was now absolute. Even the coffee machine had stopped gurgling, as if the entire building was holding its breath. "And 30 years later," Tommy continued, "he walks into a restaurant in the country he served, and some little girl who's never had to fight for anything in her entire life decides he's not worth basic human respect. Well, I've got news for you, sweetheart. You just fucked with the wrong old man. Because 30 years ago, this old man had saved his life, and what Jessica didn't know, what she was about to learn in the most public and humiliating way possible, was that some debts are too sacred to forget, some bonds too strong to break, and some insults too grave to ignore. The story Tommy was about to tell would change everything. About Frank, about heroism, about what it really means to serve your country when your country doesn't always serve you back. And Jessica was about to discover that her father hadn't just walked into Murphy's diner by accident. He had walked into the moment that would teach her the most important lesson of her life. Tommy Morrison's face went through a transformation that made everyone in Murphy's diner lean forward unconsciously. The anger was still there, burning like a forge fire, but underneath it was something deeper and more complex. Pain, gratitude, the kind of debt that could never be repaid, only honored. "You want to know what kind of man you just disrespected?" he asked Jessica, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Let me tell you about December 15th, 1968, a day that should have been my last day on Earth." Frank's eyes widened. "Tommy, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," Tommy said firmly. "Because this little girl needs to understand exactly who she just treated like trash." He turned to face the entire diner, including Jessica, who stood frozen with her coffee pot clutched in white-knuckled hands. Around them, customers had stopped pretending to eat. Even the children seemed to sense that something important was happening, something that demanded their attention. "I was 19 years old, 6 months into my first tour," Tommy began, his voice carrying the cadence of someone who had told this story before, but only to people who mattered. "Green as grass and twice as stupid. Thought I was invincible, thought the war was some kind of adventure, thought I knew everything about everything because I'd been through basic training and could field strip an M16 blindfolded." He paused, his eyes finding Frank's across the small table. Frank here was 22 and already on his second tour. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, they called him, and when he spoke, people listened. Not because he was loud or mean, but because he was the kind of soldier who brought everyone home. Every mission, every patrol, every fucking nightmare we walked into, Frank made sure his boys came back. Jessica's face had gone from pale to gray, and she seemed to be struggling to follow the narrative. This wasn't how her morning was supposed. to go. She was supposed to serve breakfast, collect tips, and complain about difficult customers. She wasn't supposed to be getting a history lesson about Vietnam and heroism and debts that lasted decades. December 15th, we were on a reconnaissance. Patrol about 10 clicks outside Duc Pho, Tommy continued. Supposed to be a routine sweep, in and out, check for enemy activity and report back. But Charlie had other ideas. They hit us with everything they had. Mortars, small arms fire, RPGs, turned our nice little walk in the woods into hell on earth. Frank shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but Tommy pressed on. I took shrapnel from the first mortar round, caught me in the leg, the shoulder, and opened up my side like a can opener. I was bleeding out fast, real fast, and I knew it. Could feel my life leaking out into the mud. The squad was pinned down. Taking heavy fire, and the smart play, the tactically sound decision, was to fall back and regroup. Tommy's voice grew stronger, more intense, as the memory took hold of him completely. But Frank here, he had different ideas. While everyone else was trying to figure out how to get out alive, he was crawling toward me through gunfire that would have made a sane man shit himself. Bullets everywhere, explosions close enough to rattle your teeth, and this crazy bastard is low crawling through it all because one of his soldiers was down. The diner remained absolutely silent. At table 3, one of the real estate agents had tears in her eyes. The construction workers at the counter had abandoned their breakfast entirely, their full attention focused on Tommy's words. He reached me just as I was starting to black out, Tommy said. Blood loss, shock, the whole 9 yards. I was ready to die right there in that jungle. And Frank looks me in the eye and says, "Not today, Morrison. Not on my watch." Then he picks me up, all 160 pounds of me plus gear, and starts carrying me toward the extraction point. Frank was staring at his hands now, clearly uncomfortable with the praise, but Tommy wasn't finished. 2 miles, Tommy said, his voice growing louder. 2 fucking miles through enemy territory with mortars falling around us and machine gun fire chasing us every step of the way. Frank carried me for 2 miles while I bled all over him, while I drifted in and out of consciousness, while I begged him to leave me and save himself. Tommy's voice cracked slightly, the emotion of 30 years finally breaking through. And you know what he said every time I told him to leave me? He said, "Shut up, Morrison. You're going home. We're all going home." Like it was just that simple. Like carrying a wounded man through hell was just part of the job description. Jessica had started crying without realizing it, tears streaming down her face as the weight of Tommy's story hit her like a physical blow. Around the diner, similar reactions were visible. The mother in booth 4 was openly weeping. The construction workers were staring at Frank with expressions of awe and shame. 3 times during that 2-mile carry, Frank got hit. Tommy continued relentlessly. Grazing wounds, nothing that would stop him, but enough to slow him down, enough to hurt. And every time he got hit, every time he stumbled, he would adjust his grip on me and keep moving. Because that's who Frank Rodriguez is. That's what he does. He carries people home. Tommy turned back to Jessica, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made her take another step backward. We reached the landing zone with about 30 seconds to spare before the chopper had to leave. Frank literally threw me onto that bird, and as we lifted off, as I was finally safe, I looked down and saw him still standing there in the jungle, making sure everyone else got out first, making sure his job was done. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ambient sounds of the diner seemed to have disappeared, leaving only the weight of Tommy's words hanging in the air like incense in a cathedral. "I spent 6 months in the hospital," Tommy said quietly. "Lost my spleen, nearly lost my leg, had to learn to walk again. But I lived. I came home. I met my wife, raised my kids, built a business, had a life. All because this man decided that leaving soldiers behind wasn't an option." He looked around the diner, making eye contact with every customer, every staff member, everyone who had witnessed Jessica's treatment of Frank. And today, 30 years later, I walked into this restaurant to get breakfast with my crew and I found the man who saved my life sitting alone at a table. being treated like garbage by someone who has never sacrificed anything for anyone. But the story doesn't end there. What the daughter learned next would haunt her forever. Because Jessica Morrison had just learned that the old man she had humiliated, the veteran she had dismissed as an inconvenience, was the same man who had carried her father home from hell when they were both young soldiers fighting for their lives in a jungle on the other side of the world. And now, in this moment of recognition and shame and overwhelming gratitude, she was about to understand what it really means to honor those who serve, what it costs when you don't, and why some lessons can only be learned the hard way, in front of everyone you thought you knew, when the weight of your own ignorance becomes too heavy to bear. If you believe that respect is earned through service and honor is measured by sacrifice, hit that like button, comment, respect, and subscribe, because some stories need to be told. Some debts need to be acknowledged, and some heroes deserve to be remembered long after the wars they fought have faded into history. The coffee pot slipped from Jessica's trembling hands and shattered against the linoleum floor of Murphy's diner. The crash echoed through the silence like a gunshot, sharp and final, but no one moved to clean it up. No one even looked down at the spreading puddle of coffee and broken ceramic. Every eye in the restaurant remained fixed on the young woman whose world had just collapsed as completely as the pot at her feet. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice so small it barely carried across the 3 feet separating her from Tommy. "Dad, is that you?" Tommy Morrison looked at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. His face, which moments before had been blazing with righteous fury, now showed a mixture of love and disappointment and bone-deep shame that cut deeper than any shrapnel wound. "Jessica," he said quietly, and in that single word was 30 years of trying to raise her right. 30 years of teaching her about respect and honor and treating people with dignity. 30 years that had apparently failed completely. "You're Tommy Morrison's daughter?" Frank asked, his voice filled with wonder. He looked between father and daughter, seeing the resemblance now in their bone structure, their stubborn jawlines, the way they both stood when confronted with something difficult. "My little girl," Tommy said, but his voice held no pride, only a sadness so profound it seemed to age him before everyone's eyes. "My little girl who I apparently failed to teach about basic human decency." Jessica's face crumpled. The confident, dismissive young woman who had rolled her eyes at an old man's trembling hands was gone, replaced by someone who suddenly understood the magnitude of what she had done, not just to a customer, not just to an elderly man, but to the person who had saved her father's life. "I didn't know," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "Dad, I didn't know it was him. I didn't know you were coming in today. You didn't know what?" Tommy interrupted, his voice sharp, with disappointment. "You didn't know he was a veteran? You didn't know he deserved basic respect? You didn't know that every elderly person in this country might have stories that would humble you if you bothered to listen?" Around them, the diner remained frozen in this moment of family drama playing out in the most public possible way. The construction workers at the counter were staring openly now, their breakfast forgotten. The real estate agents had stopped pretending to discuss market trends. Even the cook had emerged fully from the kitchen, his white apron stained with grease and his expression riveted. "Every Sunday for 20 years, Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Every Sunday I have told you stories about Frank Rodriguez, about the man who saved my life, about why I named you Jessica Rodriguez Morrison, middle name Rodriguez, after the most important person in my entire existence besides your mother." Jessica's eyes went wide with recognition and horror. "Oh God. Oh God, no. Oh God, yes," Tommy said. "The man you just treated like garbage, the man you made feel small and worthless and invisible, is the reason you exist. Because if Frank Rodriguez hadn't carried me out of that jungle, if he hadn't risked his life for mine, you would never have been born." The weight of this revelation hit Jessica like a physical blow. She staggered backward, bumping into an empty chair, her hand flying to her mouth as the full scope of what she had done became clear. "Frank," Tommy said, turning back to his old friend, "I'm so sorry. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry that my daughter, my own flesh and blood, treated you with such disrespect. I thought I raised her better. I thought..." His voice broke, the words becoming too difficult to speak. Frank Rodriguez stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, and for a moment everyone in the diner held their breath. This was the moment of judgment, the moment when the wronged party would deliver their verdict on both the daughter who had humiliated him and the father who had failed to prevent it. Instead, Frank stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Tommy," he said, his voice soft but carrying clearly through the silent diner. "She's young. She made a mistake. We all made mistakes when we were young." "This isn't just a mistake," Tommy said fiercely. "This is everything. I tried to teach her everything I hoped she would become, thrown away for what? For convenience? For the sake of a few extra minutes?" Jessica was crying openly now, her professional composure completely shattered. "Frank," she said, using his name for the first time. "Mr. Rodriguez, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to—" "You start," Frank said gently, "by understanding that every person who walks through that door has a story. Every gray-haired man, every trembling hand, every slow-moving customer has lived a life that probably includes more hardship and sacrifice than you can imagine." He gestured around the diner, taking in all the customers who had witnessed this confrontation. That man at the counter fought in Korea. The woman in booth 2, her husband died in Iraq, left her with 3 kids to raise alone. The gentleman by the window, 30 years as a firefighter, saved more lives than he can count. This whole place is full of heroes, Jessica. Real heroes. And you've been serving them like they're inconveniences instead of the people who built the world that lets you sleep safely at night. The silence that followed Frank's words was different from before. It wasn't the tense silence of confrontation, but the reverent quiet of a church congregation that had just heard a sermon that cut straight to their souls. What she did next would become the talk of the entire town. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't come in grand gestures or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it comes in the simple recognition that you have been living your life wrong, treating people badly, and that the only way forward is to change completely. Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, straightening her shoulders in a gesture that reminded everyone watching of her father's military bearing. "Frank," she said, her voice stronger now, filled with determination. "Mr. Rodriguez, would you let me start over? Would you let me serve you the way you should have been served from the beginning?" Frank looked at Tommy, then back at Jessica. In his eyes was the same compassion that had driven him to carry a wounded soldier through 2 miles of hell. The same refusal to leave anyone behind that had defined his entire military service. "I would be honored," he said simply. And in that moment, Murphy's Diner became the setting for the kind of redemption story that people would tell their children and grandchildren for decades to come. Jessica disappeared into the kitchen, and when she emerged 5 minutes later, she carried herself differently. Gone was the casual dismissiveness, the entitled impatience of someone who had never learned that service was an honor, not a burden. In its place was something new, something that looked remarkably like the respect her father had tried to teach her for 22 years. She approached table 7 with a fresh place setting, real silverware instead of the cheap plastic utensils she had been using, a cloth napkin instead of paper. In her other hand, she carried a steaming cup of coffee in the diner's best china, the cups they usually reserved for special occasions that never seemed to come. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice clear and respectful, "I would like to start over completely. My name is Jessica Morrison, and it would be my honor to serve you this morning." Frank's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile anyone in the diner had seen from him. "The honor is mine, Miss Morrison. What can I get for you today, sir? And please take all the time you need to decide." Frank looked up at her, and in his eyes was forgiveness and understanding and the kind of patience that comes from having survived real hardship. "Actually, I was wondering if you could recommend something. What's the best thing on the menu?" Jessica's smile was radiant. "My father always orders the veteran's special when he comes in. It's not on the menu, but we make it for our military customers. 2 eggs any way you like them, hash browns, your choice of meat, and toast. And the coffee is on the house always for anyone who served." "You have a veteran's special?" Frank asked, surprised. "We do now," Jessica said firmly, glancing at her father with a look that contained both apology and determination. "And from now on, every veteran who comes through that door is going to know about it." Tommy Morrison watched his daughter serve Frank Rodriguez with the care and attention she should have shown from the beginning, and for the first time since walking into Murphy's diner, his expression softened. This was the girl he had tried to raise, the young woman who understood that some people deserved special recognition, special care, special honor. But Jessica wasn't finished. As Frank enjoyed his breakfast, she moved through the diner with purpose, stopping at every table to speak with the customers who had witnessed the confrontation. She apologized to the Korean War veteran at the counter, thanked the widow in booth 2 for her husband's service, and shook hands with the retired firefighter by the window. "Excuse me," she said to the diner at large, her voice carrying to every corner of the restaurant. "Could I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" Conversations stopped. Forks paused midway to mouths. All eyes turned to the young woman who had just learned the most important lesson of her life in the most public way possible. "My name is Jessica Morrison, and I owe all of you an apology. What you witnessed here today was inexcusable. I treated a customer, a veteran, a hero with disrespect and dismissiveness. I made him feel unwelcome in a place where he should have been honored." She paused, gathering her courage for what came next. "But more than that, I realized that I've probably been doing this to people every day without even noticing. Making elderly customers feel rushed, treating people like inconveniences instead of human beings with stories and experiences that dwarf anything I've ever faced." Around the diner, heads nodded in recognition. Because how many of them had done the same thing? How many times had they been impatient with slow-moving seniors, dismissive of people who didn't move at modern speeds, forgetful of the fact that everyone around them had lived full lives worthy of respect? "So I want to make a promise to all of you," Jessica continued. "From now on, Murphy's Diner is going to be a place where people are treated with the dignity they deserve, where veterans are honored, where seniors are respected, where everyone who walks through that door knows they matter." The applause started slowly with the construction worker at the counter, but it spread through the diner like wildfire. Soon everyone was clapping, not just for Jessica's words, but for the promise they represented, for the change they had all witnessed, for the reminder that it's never too late to do better. Frank Rodriguez wiped his eyes with his napkin, overwhelmed by the transformation he had witnessed. In 60 years of life, 40 years since Vietnam, he had rarely seen someone change so completely, so genuinely, in such a short time. Tommy Morrison stood and walked to his daughter, pulling her into a hug that contained 30 years of love and pride and the promise that some lessons once learned would never be forgotten. "I'm proud of you," he whispered into her ear. "This is who I always knew you could be." But the story of what happened at Murphy's Diner that Saturday morning was just beginning. Because word spreads fast in small towns, and by evening, half the county knew about the waitress who had learned respect the hard way, the veteran who had carried his friend home from war, and the restaurant that had become something more than just a place to eat breakfast. Within a week, Murphy's Diner had implemented a formal veterans discount program. Within a month, they had created a wall of honor featuring photos and stories of local veterans. Within 6 months, the restaurant had become a gathering place for military families, a spot where service members knew they would be welcomed and honored and treated with the respect they had earned. Jessica Morrison became the driving force behind it all, turning her moment of shame into a lifetime commitment to honoring those who serve. She started volunteering at the VA hospital, visiting elderly veterans who had no family, organizing fundraisers for military charities, and every Sunday without fail, Frank Rodriguez came in for breakfast. Not because the food was exceptional, though it was good, but because Murphy's Diner had become something rare and precious in modern America. A place where the debt owed to veterans was not just acknowledged, but actively honored. Tommy Morrison would sit with his old friend, and they would share stories of the war and the peace that followed, of the families they had raised and the lives they had built. Sometimes other veterans would join them, creating an informal brotherhood of men and women who understood sacrifice in ways that most people never would. The booth where Frank had sat that first morning became known as the Rodriguez table, though Frank always insisted it should be called the honor table, because it wasn't about him. It was about everyone who had served, everyone who had sacrificed, everyone who deserved to be remembered. Years later, when reporters came to write about the diner that had become a model for how communities should treat their veterans, Jessica would always tell them the same thing. It started with recognizing that I was wrong, that I had been treating people badly without even realizing it. That respect isn't something you give when you feel like it. It's something you owe to people who have earned it. Frank Rodriguez lived another 15 years after that morning at Murphy's Diner, and when he passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 98, his funeral was standing room only. Veterans came from 3 states to honor the man who had carried wounded soldiers home from Vietnam, who had lived quietly and humbly, who had forgiven a young woman's mistake and helped her become someone better. Tommy Morrison delivered the eulogy, standing at the podium in his best suit, his voice strong and clear as he told the assembled crowd about friendship and sacrifice, and the kind of love that transcends time and circumstances. "Frank Rodriguez saved my life twice," he said. "Once in Vietnam, when he carried me through enemy fire to safety, and once in a diner, when he showed my daughter what it means to treat people with dignity and respect. He was a soldier's soldier, a man's man, and a teacher who never realized he was teaching." Jessica, now the owner of Morrison's Diner, formerly Murphy's, sat in the front row with tears streaming down her face. In her hands, she held a folded American flag that had been presented to her by Frank's family, along with a note he had written before his death. "To Jessica," it read, "who taught an old soldier that it's never too late for redemption, never too late for change, never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. Thank you for honoring my service by becoming someone who serves others. Your father would be proud." The note was signed simply, "Frank Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, retired." At the bottom, in different handwriting, was a postscript from Frank's nephew. "Uncle Frank wanted you to know that the morning you served him breakfast was one of the happiest days of his life. Not because of the food, but because he got to see someone learn what respect really means." The funeral reception was held at Morrison's Diner, of course, where 3 generations of veterans shared stories and memories and the kind of bond that can only be forged in service to something greater than yourself. The walls were covered with photos and commendations and letters from grateful families, but in the center of it all was a simple plaque that read, "In honor of Staff Sergeant Frank Rodriguez and all who serve, some debts can never be repaid, only remembered." As the sun set on that day of remembrance and honor, Jessica Morrison stood in her diner, surrounded by empty plates and coffee cups and the lingering conversations of people who had been touched by one man's example of quiet heroism. She thought about the morning that had changed everything, about the lesson learned too late but not too late to matter, about the power of second chances and the grace of forgiveness. Outside, cars pulled away carrying veterans and their families back to their lives, but carrying with them also the reminder that service matters, that sacrifice deserves recognition, that honor is not an abstract concept, but a living, breathing commitment to treating others the way they deserve to be treated. And in that quiet moment, as Jessica turned off the lights and locked the door of her diner, she whispered a promise to the memory of Frank Rodriguez and all who serve. "I will never forget. I will never stop honoring what you gave. I will never let anyone leave here feeling small or unimportant or invisible. Because some lessons, once learned completely, become the foundation for everything that follows. Some moments of shame become the catalyst for a lifetime of service. And some old soldiers, even in death, continue to carry people home." If this story reminded you that respect is earned through service and honor is measured by how we treat those who have sacrificed for others, take a moment to comment below and share your own thoughts about honoring our veterans, because their stories deserve to be told. Their service deserves to be remembered, and their dignity deserves to be protected by all of us who benefit from their sacrifice.